Welcome to Voge Academy Talks, where we take big ideas in philosophy, psychology, and spirituality and try to make them practical for living a life of meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. Not abstract, at least not ultimately abstract, but something that actually changes how we think about ourselves and motivations so that we can approach our daily lives more intentionally. I'm Matt Frawley with my co-host Nic Voge. Today, we are talking about our interactions with AI and how best to approach AI and adopt it and interact with it. So, hey there, Nic. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Matt.
All right. So, I think this was your idea, your topic. We just did we did talks on insight and mysticism, and that led you to consider coming back to this topic. So, kick us off.
Great. Well, I mean, I think one purpose I'll say is, our podcast is about living a meaningful, purposeful life. I try to use this sometimes to prompt me to learn some new things. So I feel like I'm not very knowledgeable about AI on the one hand. So creating a activity, a task that prompts me to delve in is good. It gives me extra motivation and to do it. Another reason from my point of view, in my world, in university and centers of teaching and learning, there's far more guidance for faculty around AI use and maybe telling students what to do or designing courses and assignments, but a lot less directed directly at students and how they make decisions, use AI purposely, what are the pros and cons, and to inform and educate those choices and decisions. And I think that's crucial because ultimately, whatever the policy or the intended aims of your assignment, the students will be making choices. They're the agents, they're the actors. And so their process of decision-making, problem solving, and what they know about learning, for instance, not just a policy, is going to be crucial. So that's and I want to explore that. How do we communicate that to students realistically, but also with the aim of having a meaningful, purposeful education?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm curious as I think about this. There's so many, especially in a university setting. There's obviously, well, in any setting, there's some excitement. There's a lot of fear, and I thought we explored that dimension. The fear.
Yeah.
And with that fear, thinking, all the, fear is based on some possibility. We're considering some possibilities of how this will be deleterious for ourselves, for society, for students, whatever. What do you see? How is that manifested at the university?
I think there's dread in many circles.
Dread. I love that. Even better word.
Even more than fear.
Right.
And I think some of that, so there's fear that, and some evidence that of the widespread use of AI in ways that are not constructive, they're not in alignment with the values and objectives of a higher education institution like Princeton. There's just an article I think came out yesterday. Penn has an AI problem, is what was titled. I haven't read it yet. And so there's many anecdotes and stories. There's a lot of reaction to how do we AI proof exams and papers and assignments. So I think these are very clearly aversive responses, right? Mm-hmm. But and then there's some evidence or research lifted up about how AI and the habituation to it, the use of it on a regular basis, actually undermines some important qualities that a contemplative or a deeper education and learning requires, like tolerating uncertainty or confusion, working through frustration. The ease of access can interrupt that. I think something that's not talked about, but it's even more fundamental. I think there's actually a definitional change in what counts as knowing and learning. That in the last 15 years and 20 years, maybe even more so now with the kind of AI interaction, learning, I put it simply, learning became knowing where information is, not knowing it. but knowing where I can find it.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So
I know there's this network out there and I know where I can find it. I know how to find it. And that's essentially tantamount to knowing for many purposes, because you just go look it up for that immediate task. I got to answer this question. I can go find it. Let me pull it off the internet and then put it in. And I think, and okay, so I think that's underlying. I haven't really seen that discussed. And then I think that's one theme that's maybe bigger than AI per se, but maybe magnified, because AI can give you such prompt specific information, and that prompt can be really course specific or assignment specific or even question specific. And so it's really like a scalpel. You can go get that thing. And so that can actually, it's kind of control F learning, as I've heard it described.
right. That's funny.
But there's another one, I think, which is, higher ed has faced somewhat of a crisis of purpose. What and the alignment among students. Why are students coming to university? What role does learning play in that? How much of it's credentialization or career pursuit separate from learning? And so it's not so much that AI is causing that, but AI can make that even easier.
Right.
I think. And I think that's not discussed nearly enough either.
So can I just go back to your point about how knowing is, instead of like knowing text or whatever, it's knowing where to get the information. That's a really interesting point. And I'd love to explore that a little bit, because I just remember in high school, you'd have to memorize soliloquies from Shakespeare, or poems and whatnot. That was just kind of standard. And given what you said, I assume that's less the case today, that they would do that. Maybe not. But is that an example of like knowing something versus, I mean,
I think that's one kind of knowing that we might call memorization.
Yeah. Well, the memorization, but there was assumption that by memorizing somehow it's inside you, and that maybe that wisdom of that soliloquy becomes part of your thinking. I don't know, like, this retention. Memorization wasn't just for memorization, was like, okay, these are profound statements that should somehow form you. And so memorizing them helps you and makes them accessible when you're making decisions or something like that, right? Is that less the case now, or am I just totally off track in what you're getting at there?
Well, I think that's a quintessential example, and I think I hadn't thought of that, but let me try to unpack that. So I think that particular kind of knowing isn't what I had in mind. So what I mean, so a kind of verbatim knowing, and so, but for a long time, and I think still in some like French schools and some language instruction, they have what's called recitation, and you learn exact phrasings of a soliloquy or a poem or a other source of information, and you learn a scripture probably, and certainly in Quranic studies and in Buddhism, for instance, people study and learn the exact language, and in Judaism too, I understand. And so on the one hand, I think that this kind of knowing of exact words has gone out of fashion in all levels of American education. And I, for the most part, I kind of agree with that in terms of learning, that knowing exact words isn't so important. However, I think you're getting at a couple things. One is that activity had two purposes. So one was, what is the internalizing the content, right?
Right.
And the second is cultivating the muscle of memorization and memorizing things, and how to do that in memory. And maybe if we memorize things we don't initially understand, we can continue to process them, and right, if these are profound statements and we internalize them, even if we don't fully understand them, over time we can process them. I never thought of it that way. But the main thing is that these activities have more than one function pedagogically in terms of learning too. And I think that's really important. It's not just to do the task. It's not just to be able to, when the teacher calls, I imagine an old fashioned scenario where the teacher calls on you, stand up next to your desk and then you recite the soliloquy. The performance is not the point. The performance is meant to induce you, right, to practice learning how to memorize and to internalize this really important content. The performance is secondary or tertiary to that.
Right.
But for my thinking, it's a little bit. So that's, again, that is a quintessential example. And sometimes I think in AI or other, there's a real risk that we lose fact that what we're doing is something like an exercise, to use another old-fashioned term, that we're exercising our minds and we're exercising our thinking processes by engaging in a homework assignment, or we're doing an experiment in a lab that's been done millions of times. It's kind of antithetical to what an experiment is. Right? You're not discovering something in your Chem 1 lab. That's not what you're doing, clearly. Now, you're maybe discovering it for you, and you have a unique kind of knowledge by virtue of actually doing that in front of you, and that's different than reading. But it's also not experimentation in the true sense. It's an exercise in designing and especially conducting, not even designing, conducting an experiment. And so why is that an important term to add here? Because the exercise is not aimed at the product or outcome of that activity. It's something inside of you that you then carry forward, right? And so it's a little bit like, you know, the right. We don't lift weights in the gym. I don't know how much lifting you did for diving. I didn't lift weights in the gym for my track event so that I would go out on the track and then lift weights. That wasn't the point. It was for something else, but we see the value of that, and it built the strength and the foundation and and to be able to do better at that other different thing. And it's so obvious that this is relevant, we don't even question it. But in school, I think students are going, oh, this is really going to help me. They're like, no, it's not directly pertinent or relevant. So why am I doing this?
Exactly. Right.
And why can't I offload my weightlifting to AI and
exactly.
I'll just, I'll offload my training for the marathon to my AI, and then the night, I'll be ready to go run that marathon. Like, no, I don't think the robot work doing the training, doing the exercises prepares you. So I think that's a risk. But I kind of got off track. My point is that the knowledge has to be in the organism, for lots of purposes. It's not like the output of AI is comprehensible to everybody, right? You have to have knowledge, the nature of, so the AI is essentially a reader, and it does a reading, and it produces a text, a summary of some kind, typically. Well, you still have to read it as a human. And then if you want to learn it, you have to make sense of it, which is not the same as simply reading the words, right? Oh, I have this text, all of a sudden I automatically know it. No, I need to process it. I need to bring my knowledge to bear. So the nature of reading is it's highly constructive, or learning. I have to bring my knowledge to whatever this information is to construct something inside my head. And then if I want to be able to retain that, and in the future recall it, and then and subsequently use what I recall, there's a bunch of mental processes that has to go on in my head that are distinct from simply reading the output and comprehending it. That is not sufficient. And one of the key things is that I have then, by doing those activities, I've internalized that knowledge. So I can read the next output of AI a week from now, or I can come to some other interaction that's not mediated through a computer. It's an experiment in a lab that I can't. How would I describe it to AI to be able to give me the answer?
Right.
So my position is the person has to carry around some knowledge that learning, solving problems, figuring things out is dependent on knowledge of me. And there's only so much of that I can offload. But if I mistakenly think, well, I can ask any question of AI and get an answer, so why do I need to know things, right? That's just a waste of time. That's redundant. The internet knows things. That's what we used to say, right? So I can always Wikipedia it or Google it. Now I can AI it. And there's a surface level that this is true. But also, there's not much aggregation of those individual queries, right? Who's synthesizing or integrating those? Again, you can ask AI to do that, but because it's created a text doesn't mean you understand it. And it's crucially doesn't mean, even if you understand it, doesn't mean you can use it. Right. All the time students have said, I knew that, but I couldn't do it on the test. Well, no, you only knew it to the level of being able to recall it, not use it. That's what that means.
Right.
Well, I think this is going to be really common because you as a human being have not really consolidated your knowledge, integrated it, and fabricate it in your own mind in a form that you can do something with it. You know what it is and you know where it is, but those are much more surface level kinds of knowing.
Right.
I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And so I kind of want to, if you don't mind, I want to kind of bracket that off a little bit, and I kind of want to work back to it.
Okay.
Because I think there's some interesting paths we can go down here that are worth exploring. One of which is the kind of what you just said, like, oh, let me just, what's going on inside us that says, oh, let me just offload this.
Yeah.
What does it say about us that that's what we want? I think that's really important.
Great
because
question.
that like what's the I almost want to say economy that I'm in college and I'm like, well, I'll just have it write my paper. There's a way of thinking about education that we need to address there. But even before that, and I would love to get your thoughts on, a somewhat analogous situation that we had many, many years ago, which was the adoption of the calculator.
Yeah.
And even there's the simple calculator, and then there's the
function
computer things that we had to buy for our kids in high school, when they're, and so, prior to that, you really had to, there's some offloading that's going on there, because you can just program it to do some of these calculations, which you had to do by hand
manually
previously, or manually. What are your thoughts there in terms of was there's something lost and something gained?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I threw this as kind of a bit of a curveball, but I'd be curious to think if you've ever thought about that, because on the one hand, there's a muscle that you really had to, back in my day, you had to really, it was a lot harder. You were there with paper and trying to figure all this stuff out. And then, but now you're like, okay, I don't have to do that as much, but that frees my brain up to do something else.
Yeah.
It could be good.
Well, it could be good, especially, it's good if that other thing your brain needs to do doesn't really need to understand the thing you no longer are doing.
Right. That's true. Right.
So let me give you an example. That was a little bit of a thread, but another even more recent example is statistical analysis packages. So SPSS or R.
Okay.
So,
right.
And the reason being is I learned stats in 1984 in my first stats class, and we were doing by hand. I don't know if we could even have a calculator, whatever. And so there's something you gain by, I think, something you notice about the array of numbers that you're analyzing when you're physically adding them up, and you're asking yourself certain kinds of questions and making decisions that about a kind of statistical test that you're doing, that if you offload that, and I hear students say, I don't even know what a ANOVA is, but I know that this thing can run it for me, and I know I can kind of push ANOVA and then put the numbers in and it does it. But so if you don't know what it does, how do you interpret the results?
Right.
Now, but also there was a lot of computation that went into that seems utterly tedious, particularly after you understand it. Right. Once you understand it, it seems absolutely the case that is at that point busy work.
Right.
But I would say if you play around in a data set with some numbers and you look at the numbers and you add them up and you see patterns and notice things that a central tendency, a mean, does not tell you. I think there is a kind of knowledge. I just flashed on The Big Short. You know the movie The Big Short?
Yeah.
Remember, who's that? the doctor who's a little crazy. Remember him?
Oh, the Christian Bale character.
Christian Bale. Do you remember the scene where he said he's talking to somebody? He's like, yeah, I looked at the default rates of these hundreds of thousands of mortgages. It's like, I had looked at the spreadsheets and I looked at them, and he's like, no one does that. He says, well, I did.
Yeah.
And he saw something, right, that no one else saw.
You know what? Okay. Can I just,
a
little aha here, which I think is interesting. I don't think anyone's made this point, is the importance of Michael Polanyi here. Because, we talked about the tacit dimension, and I've always told folks, I said, AI is kind of like focal awareness. It's just processing stuff, and it's not like this big aha, it doesn't make insights per se. I mean, it will run an analysis, but it's a predictive model. So it's just, it's not necessarily taking in the whole. Okay, never mind. But like basically with the tacit dimension, as Michael Polanyi talked about it, it says it's always taking the particulars. It's from the particulars to the whole. So it's like when you look at a face, like we can kind of say, oh, they're sad, they're angry, whatever. And then you say, well, how do you know that? You can't explain it. But you took in all these particular bits of information, and from those you attended to the whole. And that's the way the tacit dimension is always working. So what does that mean? Here is that, there's this ability that humans have to have insights based on from the particulars. Like this Christian Bale character, he just looked at all these numbers, and then all of a sudden he goes, oh my gosh, he had this creative insight. Oh my gosh, these things are all default. It wasn't like it added up. Deep down, he was sensing there's something wrong here, and all of a sudden he goes, oh my gosh, there's a problem. So there's a way in which you need to look at those particulars. You need to look at the machinations of how to do an analysis and so on and so forth, so that you can attend to the whole. But if you cut that off, then you're kind of lost. You're cutting off that inherent human ability to create insights and really think through, or more holistically or meaningfully, about the situation. That's okay. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I think that's a kind of unconscious cognitive processing. It's out of consciousness.
Yeah.
That we're not aware of it, fully aware of it. It can arise to consciousness, or the outcome of that can arise to consciousness. There's a bunch of processes, language processes. So let me give you an example. Almost nobody in graduate school is really taught systematically how to write like an academic. Very little. How do you learn? You read a bunch of articles.
Right.
Okay, well, you weren't. So there's a useful concept in language, that there's a distinction between language learning and language acquisition. Acquisition is a kind of out of consciousness awareness, out of conscious awareness. It comes through a lot of interaction. We might call it conditioning from a social level, or enculturation. And so you learn to think and write and analyze like a scholar of philosophy, mostly by reading a bunch of other people doing it.
Right.
And then having conversations with people in seminar and talking it over with your advisor, and you're immersed in this. And so we're internalizing a bunch of knowledge, right? And knowledge about, especially about processes, right? So what we would call in cognitive psychology, procedural knowledge. So how to tie your shoe, right? That most people, we can use that example. And most people know how to tie their shoe, but if you say, tell me the steps involved, they can't do it.
Right.
And for most reasons, for a lot of reasons, that doesn't matter. Purposes, that doesn't matter, but it could. And for the purposes of like producing something, then it really matters. Like if I want to produce a article in philosophy, or produce a report, but I don't actually learn how to do that, or acquire the knowledge how to do that. So I think the use of AI can short circuit, right, the interactions, and we don't necessarily notice what we're not learning. That kind of makes sense, right? We don't notice what we're not acquiring. It'd be a more accurate term. We don't notice as that's lacking. And that there's multiple levels of that. I simply don't know the genre conventions of an article, but there's much more basic what you're getting at, which is, I'm not really steeped into the conventions, the subtleties of the arguments. I mean, I think we can see in our own experience, if I look at my development into expertise in some area, there's a bunch of that is not explicitly reading material and processing it. Like it's, just at the literal level or the comprehending it. There's a bunch of other things going on to become an expert.
Yeah.
Now, okay, so that's one thing. So I think this is the case. Now there's a question, well, do people need to be experts in the future? Or do you become expert at using AI rather than expert in a domain? I think those are open questions. And I'm skeptical of the limit about the possibilities of AI, because I think that we underestimate the significance of this person in processing the world. You can't always have this interaction with this other resource. It has to be in here as we interact with the world. But one of my favorite quotes, because it's against what I think on the purpose. So I believe it was Socrates said,
Who is this?
Socrates.
Socrates. Okay.
Socrates said that literacy, reading and writing, would be the ruin of human memory. And I think for his conception of memory, he's actually right. People don't remember, and subsequently their capacity for memory, they didn't memorize or have the capacity to recount these Homeric tales and do all these incredible feats of memory and the memory palace and all these tools. And we lost that. What he got wrong was it didn't really matter so much.
Yeah.
Really understand what literacy is and does at a societal level. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, well, maybe I'm making the same mistake. I can't imagine a world fully steeped in AI where the individual beings' knowledge that they carry around with them in their skull
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't matter very much. I'm skeptical of that. I don't believe it, but I also think Socrates was right, but it doesn't matter. Because the world changed so much that your memory capacity just isn't demanded in the same way.
Right.
So I don't know. What do you think of that? You probably have a better handle on that than me.
Yeah. Well, I think two things. I think we're like setting up nicely that I think the what could be the deleterious, the ill consequences of one way of adopting AI, which we can talk about in a second. I think that in the coding world, where I can't say I'm some whiz bang developer, but I do live in that world a bit. We are guided by people who did code, who like for me, there was a time when I did what's called front end and back end, like a full stack developer. The back end is all the logic and working with APIs to grab information or send it and change it and whatever with the database that's living somewhere else. And the front end is just kind of what you're seeing. And I had to do everything, and I hated the front end. I'm not what's called CSS, all the styling, all the stuff. I hated that. I mean, and so AI, I'm like, sweet, do it. But nevertheless, the fact that I have gone through the drudgery of
exercise
of coding that, right? The exercise, going back to that, it allows me. I have this wisdom, I would say, in terms of this is slop code, this is too much. So I'm in a better position to guide AI, and that's what you're seeing now in terms of how people are using AI. They intuit the dangers of AI, and they've experienced how it goes off the rails and hallucinates, or just creates all this excess code that you don't need, or it just does stuff that is bad. Like I was working with a client, and there's a way to deploy an app from your, what you've coded and running on your local machine up to like something like AWS or Firebase or all these other. Anyway, I thought I was working one thing and I was using Terraform to deploy it, and it ended up wiping out a database. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so it was a great lesson. I mean, it can do that. And it never says it's sorry. It's like, it thinks it has limitations. And so, and limitations that, if not recognized and accounted for, can really lead to disastrous results. So now you see all these guardrails that developers are putting up, and now like last spring everyone was using this IDE called Cursor, where you write your code, and it was awesome because it's AI integrated. And now most people are using something called Claude Code. But when you're working, you're creating what are called markdown files, which are, it's almost like an essay when you're telling it, do this, don't do this, you got to think this way, all these ways to really corral and channel the AI, and then you let it go and do stuff. But that's a lot of wisdom going into guiding AI that frees you up. Like, I appreciate it because I don't want to write front end code. I hate it. I'd rather have AI do it, and that frees me up to do something that's more productive. So to me, there's really constructive uses of AI, but to our point, it's based on the wisdom or based that through the exercise and experience of knowing how to code properly, and from that, intuiting or at least knowing the limitations of AI, and then using it in an appropriate way. So,
yeah, can I pick up a thread there?
Please.
So, in the language of motivation, you're highly motivated to use AI out of aversion. I hate this.
Yeah.
And by virtue of your preparation and training, there's probably not a big cost to you, or you can remedy any cost in terms of your performance. You can notice when something goes wrong, and you know how to do that. But I think there's evidence that suggests that students are also using AI out of aversion, and aversion is rarely purposeful. So it doesn't have a goal other than to get away. That makes sense. So it's a very powerful motivation. Fear doesn't tell you where you're going, right? The bear, you're just trying to get away. And then you run into the street and get run over. So aversion as a motivation, super powerful, very palpable, tangible, but it's not very purposeful. So typically, and so there's some research that suggests, for instance, actually, that people use AI when they're not supposed to and plagiarize for the same reasons they procrastinate. They're confused, they're uncertain, they're unclear, they're frustrated, they're fearful, they're working under some sort of external concern about being evaluation or not meeting some goal or something like that. And so there's a lot of aversion operating. And I think you're aversive, that task is aversive, but you clearly have the goal in mind of doing something else, doing the whole, the better, right? So you have a project, you conceptualize that and say, well, this piece is small relative to this other big thing that I'm doing. And I don't think that's how most students are approaching their
right. No, I agree. Can I just put a slight
of course
nuance to not your analysis of nuance, but I think there's also, and there's an aversive component of it, but there's also a productivity component to it as well. Mm-hmm. Like any business or whatever, like when you're working with a team, you're like, hey, I'm not as good in this as you are, you should do it. So for me, like part of the reason why I don't like to do front end coding is I'm just not good at it. There's other people who, like, I have a friend who just loves doing front end. I mean, he loves the CSS and all that stuff. And so if we were working together, I'd be like, great, you do it, because I'm not good at whatever I create is doesn't look good, and I'm just not good at it, where I'm much better on back end, the logic and all that kind of stuff. So there is a way in which AI is freeing you up from stuff that you are not as good at to be focused more on, so I can focus more on what really is best for me.
I think that's a really useful introduction in inclusion. So there's sort of aversion, and then there's what are you trying to do approach.
Yeah.
Kind of approaches productivity. Now, in terms of education, so I think in a work environment, what I think Google used to say, okay, you can spend 10% of your time learning and studying, growing. You don't have to have a project. You know that? Do you know about that?
Yeah, I mean, I know that some have done that.
But they still do that? Probably not. But okay, so they're in the work world. It's 90 to, let's in the ideal, and I think they were an outlier. It's 90-10 productivity to cultivating and developing your capacity and exploring.
Yeah.
In the university, it's like 10 to 90.
Right.
University learning, higher education is not efficient. It's highly inefficient. Deep learning is inefficient. No, I'm not saying that's good or bad, and that's better, but we have to recognize that the institutional functions, right? And so the productivity discourse efficiency, which I use with students because it's also relevant for a variety of ways, but I think that might be more relevant and better suited to an environment where you're trying to produce something that is to be used, which is not an exercise, right?
Yep.
That is, it's not lifting weights to run on the track. It's running on the track to run on the track. That's what you're doing. But in school, you're lifting weights to be able to run on the track. And so if you're always focused on productivity and efficiency of that, I understand the impulse. So I think, and we can also contrast it. So there's sort of like productivity, aversion, and then there's something like growth of capacity or something like that.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. That's where, so with that, I'd love to go to the other point I was talking about, okay, what does it say when you're really offloading and not doing, like, offload my training for a marathon, and then you guys show up to do the marathon, that point that, like a student, like what, and even I think in work, it'd be easy for folks to be like, yeah, just do this marketing report, off it goes, it's good enough. I mean, yeah, like what's the mentality like, or I mean, to me, it's so tragic to have that approach to your studies at the very, and your work. And it says a lot about you. So I kind of want to get your thoughts there. I love the our whole point about self-relationality. We were always in a relationship with ourselves, and we're telling ourselves something about ourselves, or we're by, what's in our heart presses out. And so there's something about our core beliefs and what it's being expressed through this kind of I like that offloading, we so offload, so anyway, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I kind of came to this too in my notes that I wrote in preparation is, I noticed that the advice or the guidance is very similar to what we said before. Okay, gain awareness. What's motivating me?
Right.
Why am I doing this? We might go even further. How much of that is about protecting my sense of self, or projecting a sense of self, or sustaining that relative to other people, right? So Princeton students definitely say, I have to use the AI because other people are. So if I don't, I'm at a competitive disadvantage. And then what is that going to say? Reflect on me, my life chances, and my opportunities. Well, this is pretty clearly being motivated by their sense of self relative to other people. I'm not sure that they're thinking about their sense of self. I think they're thinking about their sort of material position, so to speak. But I think it's both. But in any case, the point is, gaining awareness of my situation. Now, what am I trying to do right now? And in a work environment, you have much more control, I think, of deciding that. For students, it's like, why was this assigned? What is its function? What can I learn from this? What is the benefit to me? And I think these are questions that are not often asked. I didn't ask them very much as a student, so I'm not blaming students. But I think in the world of AI, that becomes more important, because what used to be something like, am I going to do it or not? Right, that'd be kind of the question. So I was talking to a student yesterday. She said, basically what I've learned in my first year of college is what not to do. What can I not do? And so there's a term for this that was coined, in my understanding, in the late 60s and called strategic neglect.
That's funny. Yeah.
I think it's a crucial when you have too much, when you have a fire hose of information and a lot of time, then you're constantly saying, what can I not do? Strategic neglect. And I think the world of AI is a little bit different now. It's, am I going to do it or not? If I don't, I'm done. I'm not going to do that. I did that a lot as an undergrad. I'm not going to do that reading. I'm done. I'm going to do it. Then the question used to be, well, how am I going to do it? How am I going to do it well, or how much? But now it's, okay, I'm not going to do it. Or I'm not going to do it, but is AI going to do it? Or there's a third category, which is AI doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of me. I mean, I am, of course, guiding AI, but I'm just, for the purposes of clarity, it's like me not doing it, me doing it in this sort of conventional, expected way, so to speak. We could only do 100 years ago, versus an AI doing it on my behalf, my proxy.
Right. And then
that's super easy and appealing. It's like, so that's drawing you. So if you don't want to do it, so if you've decided you're going to do it, but you don't really want to do it, or it's confusing or difficult, or in some ways aversive, then you can see it's so easy to say, oh, have AI do it.
Right, because I was just going to say, because previously, if you didn't do it, well, there were consequences, where now it's less likely that you'll face those consequences, because, I mean, I think higher ed will catch up to folks who are plagiarizing, or sort of whatever they're going to call the term. But not doing the work. But I think the temptation is greater, because it's like, well, I don't have to do it, and I can have this do it and turn it in, and I get my grade, and off we go.
Right. So if you use that terminology, temptation. Okay. So, I mean, that's a space that doesn't sound like school or even intellectuals, like temptation, right? Like, okay, where does that go? We have these human impulses. We find effort. If we don't frame it as growth or significant or relevant or important to me, I want to minimize that. That's a very human inclination, I think, tendency. So I think the purposefulness of students is being taxed more, the discipline, the emotional regulation, the tolerance, the motivations, right? So AI, from our angle, you could say it's created a decision-making space that actually has more temptation to pull you away from growth, meaning, and purposeful engagement.
Yeah, I agree.
At least in the context of the class or the assignment of the task. So conceivably, people could do this, so they're doing something even more meaningful, purposeful outside of that. So they're volunteering at the old folks' home and working with people who are senile, and they're gaining, that could be the possibility. Or they're startup or whatever that hopefully has some positive social impact. I don't think the data suggests that. I think people are doing that and then on social media, but whatever. But to empathize with the students, like, you have more temptations than ever.
Yeah.
Right. And you already were faced with more temptations than ever. The whole idea of a university and a campus and the walls and the Ivy Tower was that you were separated from the mundane material world. That was the point. The Ivy Tower became a derogatory, but actually that was a positive. You're separate from the world. These places are monasteries. You pull yourself apart, and the walls used to be able to be sufficient. Well, as soon as you had Wi-Fi, the world got in.
Yep. That's a great point. Yeah.
You weren't separate from the world. So that happened, 25 years ago, on email and whatever. Okay. That was my first experience, really more email. But anyways, well, now even more, I think the sanctum of the institution is penetrated, because the particular course is penetrated. You can ask a very, very specific question that is essentially the question that your professor asked you, and get an answer. The internet kind of did that, but a lot of times not. But now it's super easy, right? 30 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 years ago, they used to call these essay mills. Remember that? Essay mill? Essay mill is you get your assignment and then you send it off through the post, through the mail, to someone, and they would write an essay.
Oh, interesting.
And mail it back to you on paper and typed out and everything.
Right.
Okay. right? That happened if you had enough money.
Yep.
And it was $10 a page or whatever, and you could do it. Well, now everybody can do that anytime. You can say, write this paper. So that, in my view, is number one, the temptations are much greater. The access to those temptations is lower because it's more powerful, right? This thing. And then in a world where the values of education are much less about personal growth and development, right? So college students don't come to college to cultivate a way of being in the world or a philosophy as much as they used to. It's much more instrumental credentialization. And I think that's an understandable, if short-sighted, response to the economic world we live in. And so it's not just AI, right? It's all these factors that seems to be contributing. And so then students have to make harder choices. These decisions are more complicated. And I might even add, so I will be a little critical of students. And because we've said so many of these decisions are based upon a kind of a certain kind of motivation that is often grounded in emotions, right? So the emotion that's unpleasant, doesn't feel good, confused. I don't think contemporary 18 to 22-year-olds have as much emotional self-regulation as they did in the past. I think they're really anxious, super stressed out. I think some of that is because of the world we live in, but some of that is, for whatever reason, they haven't acquired these skills. So if on our theory, right, you're making these decisions in part based on motivations that are not in sync with what the institution or your professor wants, right? You're not motivated to do an exercise. You're motivated to check off that the exercise was done,
right?
Or just to not do the exercise. Then it's going to be just so much easier. The appeal, the access to these things, and then it's not obvious. The consequence of that is weeks down the line, or maybe even years down the line.
I don't know if I want to interject because I think the analogy that we made to marathon sports, and even for those who are into play an instrument, I think that's really so pertinent because it shows there's no way to get around the training,
the 10,000 hours. There's no way
that you need for athletics or even for music, singing, whatever, or even, I mean, I guess art is, being compromised as well, but those are both physical activities that you just cannot get around. Now, like there's ways to use AI that are constructive in both of those. Like you can create a schedule for training, or like I play guitar, and I've been trying to compose some stuff for our church, worship music, and I'm like, I have these chords, what else could I use? I mean, I don't have the training background, so it helps me, but nevertheless I've got to be on my guitar or train. So I think those are really, we need to hold those up as examples of where like the rigor, the training, there is inconvenience, there's pain, there's struggle, boredom, right? Because the repetition that often is needed. But but if you have the goal, like you want to be a good athlete and you want to help your team and whatnot, you're more than willing to go through it. So that's getting back to who we are as individuals. You have to have this posture or this this perspective that you say it's worth it, to endure.
Go ahead, please. If you want to be an expert or professional, you're going to have to do that.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any way around it. So, my understanding is professional musicians spend a lot of time, even as professionals, doing scales.
Yeah.
and professional opera singers do the same.
Mhm.
If you talk to the NBA coaches, they're like fundamentals. They don't go away, right? And they keep doing them. It's not only that they emphasize them, they actually keep doing them. Now, you could question whether that's necessary, but so I feel confident saying if you want to be an expert in something, you need to do a lot of exercises in that thing. I think. Now, does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
And it kind of also matters how you do the repetition and exercise.
Mhm.
Right? We've all gone to practice and phoned it in and didn't get much out of it.
Right, for sure.
But I think so. The biggest question I have is the world so of knowledge so fundamentally different that expertise doesn't really matter? And I think students kind of think that.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways this is actually inadvertently. So here's one last observation. Inadvertently reinforced by some advocates of AI for students who are experts. So one of the first things I noticed is that a professor of computer science was saying AI is great. It helps me all the time. So of course it's going to help the students. And
Right.
I thought from a cognitive point of view and the knowledge point of view, it's only useful or mostly useful to you because you already have the knowledge. And it's not surprising that experts in a field don't notice, right? There's a name for it. It's called the blind spot theory. You don't notice how you're utilizing your knowledge, explicit knowledge, your tacit knowledge, your pattern recognition, your discernment and judgment that's been cultivated over years and years. You don't notice that you're doing that when you read that AI output. You think, well, a student can read it and do the same kind of thing that I do.
Yep.
But the proof that this is not the case is for every professor out there listening, both of you, how many times did you think, well, my students will totally be able to make sense of this reading, this article from the latest journal, this is awesome, or from the New York Times. They'll be able to understand it through the lens of the class. And then your assignment, it falls flat. And you're like, why can't they? Mm-hmm. Why aren't they doing that? Oh, they didn't do the reading. Well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe you're bringing all this rich knowledge to hand. It's accessible, the subtlety, the nuance, years and years of processing that's largely automatic. You don't even notice that you're doing it.
Yeah.
And you're simply assuming that it's not there. And I think this happens a lot. And so that's one concern I have, this idea that, because I've seen this essay format a few times. Oh, I was really skeptical, I was scared, then I used it, and it's great. But always it's the people doing it are experts, already experts.
Yep.
And they're not acknowledging that the importance of their expertise.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. Okay, so let's, as we kind of need to wrap it up. I mean, for me, my takeaways, obviously on a theoretical point, it was kind of, I always knew the tacit dimension had there's a distinction between humans and AI. And I think the tacit dimension is really important because, as we talked about the creative insights and whatnot, it's not just at this, our consciousness isn't just what we are necessarily aware of. There's this other dimensions going on. And I think a lot of people equate AI with human consciousness and don't appreciate the tacit dimension. And the tacit dimension is this part of us that is operative, but it does lead to expertise. And it's I mean, I don't want to get too theoretical, but just this discussion helped me kind of put that together. So that was great for me theoretically. But also practically, I thought, this analogy with musicians and sports is really helpful. And I think it's a great way for folks to start to think about how to adopt AI, because there is, that path of least resistance and kind of phoning it in and whatnot, that is a temptation for students and for professionals. And yet, what does that say about you or us that we do that? I think there's, you are denying yourself a richness to life that, it requires the pain and suffering and inconvenience and drudgery and boredom and whatnot, but it's worth it, because there is this expertise and this ability to know the world more, and the world's bigger and you're bigger in that world, and you're just more alive, and so that's worth it. But that's a decision people have to make for themselves. And then lastly, and then I'll turn it over to you. AI can play a role, and I think a lot of people, the people who are adopting it correctly, see it as, like, if you're a developer, they see AI as a junior developer. Like, you're the senior developer, you have all the expertise, and so you need to guide AI. And the people in the professional world that I work with, who say, yeah, I see it as my personal assistant. I'm like, that's great, because like back in the day, you had secretaries that would initially write your memos for you, like, or your mailings and you would edit it, so there is a way in which AI can help you be more productive without you without taking over all your work, so you can just kind of be on social media or play solitaire all day, so and I think those people who do that are retaining that kind of musician athlete perspective, and yet just using it as a way to kind of help them be that much better of a professional or a student and whatnot. So anyway, that's my takeaways.
Yeah. I mean, I'm tempted to throw a hand grenade in that comment if I.
Please.
Okay. All right. So does having a dehumanized personal assistant dehumanize you as a senior manager? I think it does, because my job with respect to my personal assistant is to cultivate them as human beings and future professionals. And that's a big source of my fulfillment in my work.
Right.
So if I don't do that, like, I'm not trying to cultivate AI as my personal assistant and say, hey, I'm going to help you get a better job next time. So I think one of the issues with, like, human AI relationships, it's not that AI is, AI tells you what you want to be. You can't be kind or sacrifice to AI. So there's a whole range of human behavior and actions and intentions and motivations that the nature of interacting with the machine does not permit you, that make you fully human. But let me
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I think that it's not to say you have an actual relationship with AI. It's just a way to approach it.
Yeah.
And adopt it. So I don't think that it dehumanizes you, because because I could yell obscenities to it all day and it never gets offended and walks away. So I guess it could be, but it doesn't mean I'm locking myself away and only interacting with this AI. It's just a way to say, okay, I can adopt this for me.
Yeah.
Amongst working with humans, it's just a perspective. I think it's a way to adopt a tool that limits or corrals how you use it. And that's why I appreciate that perspective.
Well, I think for you, but there's a lot of people their main social interaction is at work with their personal assistant, or at least was. You have a rich social life that you're interacting with lots of people. If everybody you now interact with is either mediated by these things or is one of these things, what is the cumulative effect of that? 8 hours a day, or 10 or 12 if you work at Google or whatever, you're not interacting with that person, that junior person, where you're thinking about them as full human beings. This is purely theoretical, and it just occurred to me, so I don't want to spend too much time on it.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it is a possibility.
I said a hand grenade. I did want to kind of be somewhat provocative.
Yeah, all right, good.
More than provocative.
So,
but I think
the floor is yours.
The thing I would say is, from the lens of fulfillment, if you want to feel fulfilled, you have to do difficult things.
Yep.
If you want a sense of accomplishment, you have to do difficult things. And I think that AI can really interrupt that. So one of the things we have to add is, it's not just that it's morally bad to do it, or it's the right thing to do, it's virtuous or wholesome to not use AI. It's, what is the consequence for you? Do you want to feel fulfillment? Do you want to have a sense of accomplishment? So when I tell students, you really can't have a sense of accomplishment, they get stunned. Like, whoa. So they recognize that, but they realize they're not operating, right? They're not making their decisions with that awareness of what it means to be a human being. They're seeking aversion. They're getting away from pain or difficulty or confusion, which is completely understandable, but they're not recognizing necessarily, oh, but that's also the source of growth, improvement, sense of accomplishment, learning, right? I'm strengthening myself. And so that's really easy and totally understandable, but that's not top of mind. So I would say one practical thing, because that's not my strength, but one practical thing is this, in this decision-making process is to say, in my use of AI, am I seeking meaning, purpose, growth, fulfillment, expertise? I think is where we landed. Does this really add to my expertise? And if I want to be an expert, does it help me with that? A second practical thing would be to ask this other question. Do I want my surgeon to be using AI to learn their chemistry, or my heart surgeon? The person who builds the bridges that I drive on, do I want them to offload this work? I think we would be much more circumspect in how we do it if we said, oh, this actually has some consequences, right? There's real consequences. And I think about the consequences for me. Like I will tell you, any budding engineer out there, I do want you thinking, is my use of this going to help me build a safer, stronger, more reliable, more energy efficient bridge that millions of people are going to drive across?
Well, can I just interrupt you? I think the answer can be yes.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, that's a decision, not an answer. It's a decision.
Exactly. Yeah, I just want to make sure people understand that we're asking a question, and so it's how it's used.
Exactly.
Yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean to. I just wanted.
That's why I phrased it as a question. I'm not trying to predetermine or prescribe. I'm trying to say that you as an individual need to. So what's a concrete way for you to kind of make that decision? Is to pose it as a question, right? And that's not the only question. I already gave two. So clearly there's other questions, right? Am I seeking meaning and purpose? Is this okay? Would I want my surgeon to do this, or my lawyer, or whatever? If I'm facing a death sentence, would I want my lawyer to have offloaded, or my pet in vet school? Whatever. There's all kinds of.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So are we good?
I think. Let's see.
We solved everything here. How to integrate AI in our rapidly evolving world.
Well, I'm going to use a little. There's a word I've been trying to use more than solve lately, which is resolve.
Resolve. Ooh, all right. I like that.
So perhaps we brought resolution, clarity to some of these decision making, right? Like, what are some ways of seeing the challenges, the temptations, the possibilities? So maybe we've brought some resolution to what I think is a genuinely complicated, unclear problem space where, in my case, young people are making difficult decisions.
Yep. And and my last word my previous last word was a bit of a sales pitch here, is the importance of our creative problem solving course. Because throughout that, and what we talked about here, is trying to raise up the individual to say, what do your actions say about yourself? And do you really appreciate and love yourself as much as you should? Because if you offload and do all these things, you're taking an easy way out that says, you don't, I don't want to put this, you're such a, each individual is really an amazing creature. And we just want people to appreciate that about others, but really start by doing that, by appreciating yourself and just wanting a really rich, full life for yourself. And, these compromises that we make in order to, in a very demanding world, it's very easy, as you said, with students, the temptations are there. We understand that. But the resistance to those temptations comes to really appreciating and loving yourself. And I think that's what we really advocate for.
Yeah. I found myself thinking, do you love yourself enough to cultivate and grow yourself for yourself more than performing or producing in the class or for somebody else? And that's a tough choice, but framed in that way, I think does bring some clarity,
Yep.
resolution.
Yeah. Amen. Nic, thanks. Great
Thank you.
stuff.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's great. Awesome. Okay. Until next time, take care all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.